So first of all, Mary, thank you for joining me again. I really wanted to do a follow-up. You know, our original podcast on My Summer with Nisargadatta is very popular. You know, a lot of people listen to it. And I wanted to do a follow-up. And as I've said to you, I envision this someday as a book of some sort of or another. And because, and I wanted to say a word as to why, because I'm hoping we can pursue this line of thought in future episodes as well. But I feel like you had a very interesting experience having spent the summer with Nisargadatta. I have other podcasts with other people like John Baker, who co-wrote Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism with Chogyam Trungpa, and who lived with Trungpa when he first moved to America for a time. You know, these are experiences, nobody's going to have that experience again. You know, that came and went. Trungpa's gone, Nisargadatta's gone. And I feel like it's not, I don't want those experiences to be lost from memory, from our cultural memory. You know, there's something important that happened in which people like you at a young age caught a kind of optimistic fever about something called enlightenment that you were hearing about from the East, that you recognized to be something incredibly significant. So much so that you devoted your whole life to it. And I feel like over time, what naturally happens is something that starts out very innocent, very fresh, very amazing. As it gets more popular, you get examples of people who take it in bad directions. It becomes commercialized. It gets wrapped up in a kind of economic system. It takes on a lot of qualities that are distasteful, and then the original inspiring kernel that was attracting people kind of gets lost in the shuffle, and it's the negative manifestations that are almost inevitable for just about everything. You know, they say the same thing about like people talk about rock and roll music, you know, when it was so innocent and fresh in the beginning, and then it becomes a business, and then there's excesses and problems. It's almost inevitable, and then the whole thing gets painted as somehow off. So I want to use podcasts like this to capture that kernel, the thing that was driving so many people like yourself to devote your life to enlightenment, and then, you know, obviously also what you discovered, and so that spirit doesn't get lost, so that the original inspiring nut of inspiration continues to have a voice that can be heard among all the chatter. And by the way, I have my copy of I Am That.
I think mine's in it. It is. I don't know if you can see it.
Oh, is yours from those days?
No, unfortunately, when I moved from America, I actually had it right through till when I left America 7 years ago. And I had a whole lot of books packed up, and I lost one of those boxes. And that was, I know. Can you believe that? That's
amazing.
I know. It's really tragic, but anyway. Somewhere someone might have it, hopefully.
That's right. You can still get copies.
Yeah. I also, just to say, this is a sideline, not part, but I had the original manuscript that was handed to me. It was literally just a typed brochure of U.G. Krishnamurti's book, which called The Mistake. It was called The Mystique of Enlightenment.
Yes, The Mystique of Enlightenment.
When he handed it to me, he said, this should have been called The Mistake of Enlightenment. That's a whole nother story.
Oh, that's
And
funny.
it literally was typed. It wasn't, yeah. And that went too. And I had this thing.
I see. I hear another podcast.
Right. That was a different one. Yeah. Different meeting.
But fascinating also.
Yeah. Very fascinating. Yeah.
So let me, what I thought, because we did one podcast, so we've kind of got like a general outline of the story, but I wanted to go a little bit more deeply into some specifics. And the first thing I wanted to ask you was just, when did you first find out about Nisargadatta, and what was it that made you decide that you wanted to meet him?
Okay, well, just first, before I say anything, I just want to thank you, Jeff, for inviting me back on.
Oh, of course.
I'm really glad, that there is that interest in still, in the Nisargadatta, and yeah, it's really good, because I think we would both, you said a lot, and I totally agree about what happens in time with these things, but that kind of depth of just truth, unadorned, non-ideological, pure transmission from somewhere else within a human being who's very human, is profound, and hopefully doesn't get lost, because that's what we need more than ever, I think, now. But and I still consider myself incredibly fortunate and blessed, or however one sees that, privileged to have been able to spend that time, particularly with him, but having those years of being able to devote and immerse myself completely in this more than a subject, in this sort of life defining arena, really, depth. So yes, what was it? I remember really clearly, funnily enough, exactly when I heard about it. And it was, I think it was in 1976. And I was living in a little tiny hut. Yeah, I was living in Tiruvannamalai, actually, which in those days was a tiny rural village of which there were literally only 5 Westerners living there. And I'm saying that because now I know it's a very vibrant, place that people, destination, and also resident. A lot of people live there. But in those days, it was very small, very rural in 76. And I had a little hut that I was doing in a kind of compound very near the ashram. It was a little thatch hut. It had one room, a little porch, and I was doing a lot of meditation in that. And I was obviously there because of the teachings of Ramana Maharshi, which had really spoken to me. And so I was doing long periods of very protracted practice. And I would read just a small bit of Ramana's work and his teachings, and then I would meditate, right? That was the context. And then one day it was actually, I'm pretty sure it was Murray Feldman, who came in, because he was one of the 5 Westerners living in that neighborhood. And he came in and he had this book, and he said, you've got to read this, And it was I Am That. It had been, I don't know, recently published, I think, but only in India. It wasn't in the West. And I took it, and I had no electricity, Jeff, and I think I ruined my eyes actually from that night. But I started to read it, and I didn't stop. Right? I was a whole night by candlelight with that book, right? And what it was is, I thought, oh my God, Nisargadatta, Sri Nisargadatta is alive, right? I was there studying, and and Ramana Maharshi ashram, I think, still is a very vibrant place. It's a very good place to do this, to do serious sadhana and practice, etc. But this book was just alive. It spoke very, very directly to me, and I knew it was just slightly different expression, but the same truth that was speaking. It just spoke to me as being undeniably true, and I realized that he was alive, right? Because somewhere in the book it said that in the beginning or end. And I came out of that, and I think I just said to Murray, I'm going, because I realized he was living in Mumbai, Bombay at the time. And I don't know, but within not long, maybe a week, I got on a train and went across to Mumbai, right? There's one little tiny caveat to this story that I want to tell you, which I think is quite nice. At the time too, I was, it wasn't really my teacher, but I loved him, was the beggar. And he was Ram Sarat Kumar, who was this, very colorful, profound, sweet, enlightened person who was living on the steps of the huge temple in Tiruvannamalai. And he was, you probably know this, but Lee Lazawak's guru, actually.
I was going to ask you. I thought that was Lee Lazawak.
Yeah, he was. And I also spent a lot of intimate time with him, intimate meaning close, time with him. A very, very, very different kind of teacher, but had his own thing. Anyway, I took this book along because it had a photograph in the front of it of Nisargadatta sitting, I always remember he picked it up, he looked at me, and he flicked through it, spoke perfect English, Ram Sarat. And he read a couple bits. He put his head on the feet of the photograph, the photograph in this, he said, "You should go." I was going to go, but it was just very, he said something, "You should go, this is for you." And I was anyway, but that was like it was just very nice, to have that.
It's great confirmation.
Yeah, it was really was confirmation, because I think he obviously knew me quite well. Anyway, I traveled over and that's what got me to go. Because I would say there was reading that book, I literally couldn't put it down. There's such a transmission still from that book, right? And at the time, if you imagine, I was living there only doing sort of sadhana. So it was like pure, kind of, it was like imbibing, nectar, really. Yeah.
Beautiful. So you decided to go. You got a blessing to go.
Yes. Yes.
And then you went. So before we get to your actual meeting, I wanted to ask you a more general question about the time, because this 1976, there weren't a lot of Westerners in India at that time. It was there were some adventurous souls were there, and among those souls, among those Westerners that had made that journey. And I guess what I want to ask you is, what first drew you to go to India? How did that occur? What did you because you were living in England, I assume?
No, I was actually in Australia.
You were in Australia.
Yeah.
So what did you discover in Australia that then compelled you to go to India in the first place?
It's a good question. Well, I mean, very interesting. And this probably sounds a little strange to some of your listeners, but I was probably around, I don't know, just before I left high school anyway, about 18, I was already feeling, I guess, a restless spirit, right? I was already feeling, I think, the kind of enclosure of the culture I was in, which is, regular culture, right? Middle class culture. And it felt confining to me. And I was coming to an end, and, I was fortunate. I got a scholarship because to go to university, and I was thinking, what am I going to do? But at the time, I was out of that restlessness. I was already reading books that I had no idea, Jeff, that I was seeking something. Really, I didn't have that concept, and I had no one around me. My friends actually were very political, my close friends, because it was during, I think I told you this at the last one, it was during the era of the Vietnam War, and we were very politically orientated, and social justice, et cetera, political justice, and Australia, and there was a lot around that. But I had this other thing. I felt like I was drawn to books like, that Herman Hesse and who else? Alan Watts, Roman Pirzik. I remember reading that one, The Art of Zen, what's it called? The Zen of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Yes, the art of
right. the Zen of that. And one of the books I read was a book called, it was one of Paul Brunton's books. And he wrote a whole series. He was in the 40s, I think. He traveled around the world at a time that was pretty rare. And he met a lot of different, bit like Gurdjieff, remarkable people.
Yes.
And one of those was Sri Nisargadatta. Ramana Maharshi. And he had a chapter. I think it was called something like the Red Mountain or something, but it was something that mentioned mountain. And he had a chapter on his meeting with her. And that reading about that, I was like, wow, I felt drawn. Really, I just thought this is, it spoke to something that I wasn't finding, I think, in my own culture. And at the time, I didn't have the kind of consciousness to understand that. But so I was sort of finding my own way. And I literally had not one friend who is sharing that spiritual side. It was an era where we were seeking, though, I will say, there was psychedelics, and it was more in the context of seeking something beyond our culture, and that went along with the political activism and all of that, which was all part of that too. It was sort of a resistance to the status quo.
Right.
So that was all kind of part of the era I think I was born into, and not everyone was part of that. But this reading led me to go to choose at university I studied Sanskrit, I studied Hindi, I studied Indian philosophy and history. And I also studied one thing with Mao and Leninism. That's always been there, interestingly enough. But I did that, and I felt deeply drawn to a different way of looking at the world, of understanding a deeper philosophical, I guess, framework for the world. And I had no spiritual background prior to that. So I was drawn to that. And then at the end of my studies, I had the opportunity to continue at university. I had that opportunity, but I didn't want to. I just, and I think it was around that time I actually read Brunton's book, and I thought, I'm just going to go to India and find out and just see. I felt like I had this sort of, I remember my mother asking, why India? Why are you going to India? And I remember sort of saying to her, I have to go. I just have to go. I don't really know why, but I feel I have to go. And what it was, Jeff, is I was very clear. I didn't want to go with anyone. I was 21 because I didn't want to have that reference point where you're engaging or meeting a culture through the eyes of something that you're sharing with someone else. I really knew I had to go alone. And that was important because it's just you and whatever. And so that was why I went. I didn't know what I would find there, but I felt from the books, I had also, interesting enough, Ram Dass's book, Be Here Now, which had just come out around that time. And he, of course, that was inspired by his meetings with his teacher. So all of these things just spoke very directly to me, I think, some part of myself. So yeah, that's why.
One of the things I find fascinating, there's a couple of things I find fascinating about that. The role that books have played in so many people's path. I mean, if you're in Australia in the early 1970s, where else are you going to encounter this?
Right.
And so books played such a big part in spreading, spreading the news about this spiritual pursuit and what was available in India. The other thing that strikes me is when you went to India in 1976, which is, I didn't go to India until 1992. But I haven't been since 2005. I'm sure it's quite different now than it was last time I was there. But even by the time I got there were quite a few, like Westerners were there. And wherever you went, it wasn't like, it wasn't inundated with Westerners, but you saw Westerners. Westerners were, there were certain hotels where the Westerners stayed. and there were always seekers, so where you said you didn't want to go with anyone because you wanted to be immersed in that culture without the connection back. It then came to a point where the connection back was there, and from what I hear from people like you who've been more recently, and my wife Amy, who went a couple of years ago, all the more so that you feel the Western influence now
very much
in India. So it's not quite like, it's not quite the escape from your culture that it was.
Definitely not.
When you first went.
No, it still is. I think if you go far enough away from sort of that sort of classic places that a lot of Westerners are at, either tourists or seekers, you still meet something pretty different than our culture. But that's in fairly remote places, I have to say, or villages outside. So yes, one thing though that was at that time, you're right, there were virtually no tourists. I'll say that. There was no tourists because India wasn't a very easy place to be from that level. No real hotels, proper hotels that people would feel comfortable in much. There were small ones. But interesting enough, there was quite a wave of people seeking. And I didn't know that, Jeff, and until I turned up there. And they were seeking in different ways. For some, it was just an escape, I think, from their cultures. There were a lot of French there who were escaping into a lot of sort of very, kind of Sadhu world. They were like, it was pretty wild. There were people who unfortunately escaped into a lot of drugs. There was a lot of heroin available in India then. And there were people who escaped or who were seeking through music. There were a lot of people who were attracted to studying classical Indian music. And that could have been, because of Ravi Shankar, and, that was already filtering out. So when I got there, I was surprised. It wasn't like there were lots of people, but there were people there. And the thing that I felt really I was hit by, because one of the first places I went to was Bodh Gaya. I didn't know. Someone just said to me, you should go there. I got to Calcutta and I was like, what am I going to do? I didn't really know. And there I encountered these people, right, from all over the world. And nothing like the numbers now. You're absolutely right. But there were people there. But what was different, well, not different, but what was really was everyone was sharing. It was amazing. You'd hear about this, you'd hear about that. There was no internet. So you didn't ever find anything on the internet. And the thing that struck me as being very different about that time, you're right, was because there was no internet, there were no phones, certainly no smartphones, but there wasn't even any kind of phone. And so you were really like it's going to the other end of the world. There was nothing familiar. You really left behind your culture. And the only way to communicate was through, letters that would be kept for months in certain places, post restaurants, they were called, certain post office. You could pick stuff up. But otherwise, you were alone in a very, very different culture. And I think that had a powerful effect on everybody, actually.
Well, I guess I also just love the spirit that you're describing that people had. There was this radical spirit of wanting to discover something different.
Yes.
That people were feeling suffocated by the culture that they were in, by the roles and expectations that they were living under. And some people, at least, as you said, not tons, but significant numbers, were willing to just leave the world they knew and explore something radically different in search of a better way, a better possibility, a better way to be human, a better. Yes. And I just think that spirit that you must have encountered among people. And of course, as you said, people were exploring all different things, and some were probably better than others. But everybody was sharing. Everybody appreciated. Everybody shared the same radical spirit of discovery and was willing to support each other's discovery, was sharing teachers, and like you said, shared the book with you, and and I think it was a beautiful mutual recognition of that was born out of the optimistic spirit that something much better was possible if we could just figure out what it was.
Yes. No, I think that really is, I think that captures it very well. And you mentioned the thing about books, how the impact books had. And I would say that there was a kind of a convergence of that restlessness of spirit. And when I say restlessness, I don't mean just casual restlessness, but there was a sense of looking for something more meaningful, right? Because our culture at that point was really, coming out of the war and then the 50s and all that, it was already becoming very, very sort of material. Our values were very specific, the roles, as you say, all of that was really happening. And so there was a big push back, as we know, in the end of the 60s. And I think the push was at a deep level, one of consciousness, yearning for something more meaningful, that et cetera, plus the Vietnam War was going on, which sort of, it articulated something not good about our culture, et cetera. So I agree. I think it was the confluence of that seeking of something and that intuition, this optimistic intuition that's deep at this, I think the heart of all of us, actually. I really do. I still feel that. Seeking, and the only place I could in Australia at that point, you're right, were through books. And the books were beginning to come out at that time that were speaking to that. So it was a perfect, in a way, I think these things happen. They're sort of eras, conscious eras of consciousness. Yeah.
Definitely. Okay, so let's go back to you arriving in what was then Bombay, is now Mumbai. Do you have an address for Nisargadatta that you know to go to, or do you arrive and then have to find him?
Yes, I had an address. I think it was in the book. I'm trying to think. Yeah, I think it was. There was also a contact I had in Mumbai that someone had given me of someone who knew about different people, and he was really interesting. But I think I already had it. I could be wrong. It could be he told me. But I still had to look. It was in a very, it was in quite a very poor area of Mumbai, and it was hard to find. Nothing was marked really clearly, right?
Right.
So
addresses in India,
yes.
I'm sure, even when I was there in the 90s, were not. It was
exactly
not like an address with a street and a number.
No, exactly. So I found it by wandering around that neighborhood, actually, and asking. And I had heard that he was a beedi wala, this little Indian cigarette seller. And so I was looking in those kind of stores and asking and And finally, someone pointed me to, or led me to this big old rambling dark, at that point, sort of tenement building, really. And there was a little beedi shop underneath, but it turned out it was his son who was running that at that time. He'd retired. And I went in, and I think a child or someone led me in there, to the right building, to right flat apartment. And, I knocked on the door, and I still remember this really clearly. It was actually his daughter who came to the door. And I had brought some oranges to take, as a very simple gift. And she sort of brought me in. I spoke Hindi, but not Marathi, but enough people speak Hindi. And so we communicated. And she sort of pointed to a part of the house with some steep stairs. And she said to me, basically, come back. I don't know what time that was. I can't remember. I think it was too late in the day. She said, come back at 10 in the morning. And so she took the oranges. And so anyway, I went away and spent the night. And I came back the next morning at 10. and she took me in, and I think I told you this, but I might have mentioned this in the last podcast, but I went up those stairs. They were very steep. And I got up the top, and there he was, Nisargadatta, as he always was, sitting. He used to sit on this very old animal skin. You know, it was a classic sort of situation. And he was sitting there, and he looked up at me, you know, as I came in, and he looked absolutely directly at me. And he had these incredible eyes. I mean, they just, on one hand, they looked right through you, but on the other hand, they were connecting. And they had this sort of you know, which I've seen in other people's rarely, but I have that depth, almost like a kind of, you know, an extraordinary depth, and very piercing. He was incredibly focused, Nisargadatta, you know, he was very focused. And he just sort of summoned me over, you know, and I went, and I had never in my life prostrated to anybody. And I got down on my knees without even thinking. And that was very surprising to me, whether it was from, well, who knows what, but I hadn't actually done that. It never felt really authentic to me, but I did. I knelt down behind him, just sort of, you know, which is a greeting in India anyway, put my head down, and he sort of said, get up, and, you know, sat me down, indicated for me to sit down. And you know, he in that very first meeting, he didn't speak English, but he had someone with him. There was no one else in the room but one person. And he became the translator for me for most of the time I was there. And he was a beautiful man. I think he's dead now, but he was really a simple man, and an incredible translator. I almost don't think of my time with Nisargadatta as being through a translator, because it was such an immediate thing. And I think Nisargadatta probably understood a lot of English, because it was very direct. Yeah.
So tell me, so you arrived, you and this person who became your translator were the only other two people in the room with Nisargadatta.
Yes.
What did you feel? Did you feel any kind of spiritual radiance in the
from
room?
him
From Nisargadatta?
Yeah, I felt there was, let me think how I would say that. Yes, I felt this, it was like he had an incredible presence, if you know what I mean. I wouldn't say it's much radiance. He was incredibly present. There was a presence of, on one hand, deep stillness, right? That he was absolutely like a rock, you know. And at the same time, he's incredibly energetic spiritually. So as I said, there was this kind of, but not in a threatening kind of way at all. I never felt intimidated, except on another visit, which I told you about. He told me off very strongly. Right. But yeah, that I felt immediately no separation from him. I think I could say that. I didn't think that. Thought didn't go through me, but I felt immediately a kind of, you know, don't want to use the word oneness, but, you know, I didn't feel any separation. Yeah.
Sure. Now, do you have any recollection of what you spoke about on that first meeting?
I don't, Jeff, specifically, but what I know is that I just shared with him everything that I was exploring at the time, right? And I know that because I know that I did quite a lot of talking. He asked me, you know, why I was there, and I didn't really have a question. I just shared with him my kind of understandings up to that moment, and and by that point, I think I had, you know, I had definitely had more than moments of, you know, quite deep spiritual experience, epiphanies, and, you know, but like everyone, they would disappear and I'd be grasping at them again, and, you know, all of that. And so I really was talking to him, I think, about all that. And I think one of my deep questions for him, I don't remember the way I framed it, but was really, I wanted to find how you could kind of stop going in and out of these things, because I had no doubt about, you know, about, I don't know how to even say it, but about really the
about what you were experiencing,
about what I was experiencing. Yeah, about the really non-dual nature of reality myself. I'd had that literal that experience where you are not separate from anything else. There's just a total dissolution, but absolute aliveness and awake. I'd had taste of that, but I didn't know what that really meant. I didn't know how that could become who you were. You're kind of, So my questions were more around that.
So what's interesting, one of the things that's interesting to me is what you just described, because I think this is something that happens in the presence of a deeply realized teacher, which is you're compelled to kind of bare your soul, your spiritual soul, right? Because here you are with someone that you inherently know has wisdom that you're looking for. Like they know something that you don't know. They've experienced whatever it is. You don't know exactly what it is, but you're really wanting something. You believe they have what you want, and so there's a motive to be completely transparent, right? There's you don't want to hide anything from them, right? Because you want them to see who you are, because you really are. You really believe they can help you, and you don't want them to have to guess at who you are. And there's no motive. There's a depth of trust in that connection, which I think it probably, that sense of oneness, non-separation. Part of that is there's just total trust that you understand that this person sees with a kind of clarity, is as interested in what you're interested in, that you're both completely interested in that, and therefore there's no reason to hide. And so you just want to be open.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. And it's very, very interesting what you're saying, Jeff, about that trust, because at the time you're not conceptualizing it as that. You don't think, I trust this person. But for me, I think the experience of what that was is when I read that book, it wasn't like reading a book about anything. There was a direct transmission. And I think what engenders that non-separation, that profound trust and literal wanting, as you said, there's no reason not to be transparent, is because you are recognizing already what they know. Do you know what I mean? There's a recognition.
Right.
So for me, the question was, I had no doubt. I went to him knowing kind of he was it. He was authentic. So I had that deep experience of trust already before I went, because I experienced it in the book, from the directness. So it was very, very interesting. There was just that.
That's interesting, because a book like I Am That, if in order for it to have a very profound influence on you in the way that it did you, that you traveled across India, a week after reading it, it's because exactly what you said. It's because you have experienced something that you recognize in those words. And so part of when you arrive, that person has experienced what you're experiencing, and seems to have stabilized in it in a way that is typically what occurs. Is you say, not only have they experienced what I've experienced, they've stabilized in it in exactly the way I know is possible, but I don't know how to do it.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And so do you have any memory of, in terms of your question, right? Your question was, how do I stabilize in this? How do I keep it from coming and going? I don't, it doesn't have to be that first meeting, but what was his answer? Like, because I realize I want to make clear, I understand that an encounter like what you had with Nisargadatta, and this was the first day that ended up being a summer of being with him every day. There's very little self-conscious awareness in a certain way going on. In other words, it's kind of an unfolding.
Yes, very much.
And you're so it's like you're in a flow, and you're so in the presence of the moment. Someone like that is drawing you into the presence, and you want to be, you're so close to what's happening. There isn't as much separation to draw conclusions about it from the outside. It just kind of all happens.
Exactly.
And so I understand that your memories will be a little indistinct.
Yeah.
But what would you say was the message you received from him, whether he said it or not, I don't know, in terms of how to stabilize in this?
I remember quite clearly, in a way, it wasn't like one answer, but I remember one specific dialogue. Because just to say, Jeff, that I want to just pick up on what you were saying, that in the presence of someone like that, I felt that, and he wasn't someone who did Shaktipat, or he had nothing like that going. He wasn't interested in that. But you're right, in the presence, that very presence drew out that presence in me, that consciousness. Like, so once I was there, and we would have a lot of dialogue together, just exploring, actually. I remember we spent a lot of time really, just opening all this up. But then this question was what, why I was there, right? And the whole thing, as you said, just unfolded. In fact, there was one moment where I was nearly run over on the road outside, because I realized, oh my God, I have to be careful, right? Because I was so in this other thing, I was sort of oblivious a little bit to my environment. And India's, as you know, the streets are very busy. So that was all happening. But yes, his answer to me, actually, and it was said in different ways at different times, I think, but the one I remember very clearly was, and I think it could have been I'd come back one day with repeating that question or something like that. I don't know how I did it, and he said to me, because by that point we were like this, we were so in sync, so undivided, and I think I told you last time, we even used to go for walks and, all of this kind of thing. It was just a very immersive time, right? And anyway, he said to me, I know what it is with you. It's because of Christianity. He said, you have doubt, whatever you want to call God, or, he said that. He said, it has to be because you're Christian. I wasn't particularly Christian, but he said that. He said, and what he said was very, very interesting. He said, when my guru basically confirmed his awakening, or whatever words he used for that, he certainly wouldn't have said it like that. He said, I trusted him. And he said, I trusted him completely, and I surrendered to that. And the profundity of that, Jeff, I don't think I definitely didn't get at the time, right? I think I was more stuck on, no, I'm not Christian, or I don't know what I was stuck on, but the absolute profundity of it was very, very interesting, because much later, I did understand that to some, more to a greater degree, because what he was saying was that there is a degree of surrender to reality, right? To the depth of that. And at the same time, part of the reason I, like so many others, kept slipping in and out, and was, you could say, the doubting mind. It was like the doubting mind, meaning that I wasn't surrendered enough. One way to say it, I wasn't surrendered enough to let go of my belief in, all my insecurities, doubts, belief in being a separate person, et cetera, which is not surprising. That's the consciousness and worldview and everything I was born into very strongly in a Western culture. So in one way, he's right about the Western culture, maybe, but he saw it in that simpler way, in that, using that. And on one hand, it can sound incredibly simplistic, but on another, I think it was actually very profound, because he was saying once he let go, that was reality. It wasn't like he had to fake it or he had to act like that. It just was reality because of the depth of trust he had in his teacher, who I'm assuming had that same relationship he wasn't being asked to trust something his teacher said or believed in. He wasn't being asked to trust something, an ideology or anything like that, but just to trust the depth of his own experience, really. And that's it. No buts, just that, and let that unfold as who you are.
Right. And I think this is a very interesting point, because, and also his identification that it was because you were Christian, which the way that sounds to me is less that, you had some strong Christian beliefs, and so that was a problem. I think maybe what he was identifying was that because you grew up in a Christian culture in which, at least for some amount of time, regardless of how much you were practicing, it's part of the culture that the Christian faith is a picture of reality, of spiritual reality. So then when you pursue, a Hindu path, and you immerse yourself in a culture in which that's assumed to be a spiritual reality, but now you've got two, right? Where
Yes.
For someone like him, he was raised in that culture. The overarching context was that these Hindu teachings were a valid picture of reality. And so in a way, maybe he was pointing to the fact that the challenge of developing that kind of trust, and I know he wasn't thinking this, but the challenge of that in a kind of postmodern context where we're aware that there's all different faiths, and that every, this is, how does this work? There's so many different faiths. Within each faith, they completely believe that picture of reality is the real reality. But if you're seeing them all, it's hard for you to believe that any one of them could be the one real reality. So you need to have some way to surrender to the truth that you discover outside of the traditional cultural context, which might ultimately be more supportive of it. I mean, I don't know. I just think that's I think it's very fascinating. And I think I'm just seeing that from our modern ears, talk about that kind of, my teacher told me, so I trusted.
Yes.
In America or in the modern West, all you can think of is that must mean I forced myself to trust, right?
Yes,
because
exactly.
the possibility that you would just trust is just not, it's not part of our cultural context, where for him it was like the teacher said it, so it's true. And there was no questioning.
Exactly, Jeff. And I think I want to really kind of penetrate this a little bit, because it wasn't that he was not discriminating, or he really encouraged critical thinking and questioning, real questions. What he was that's why I said he wasn't pointing to trusting an ideology, because even he didn't identify as being a Hindu, actually, funnily enough. None of those teachers, he was from that tradition. But the Dharma was always, the Advaita Dharma was not seen as Hindu, and that's why it was not now, I have to say, but in ancient India, it was regarded as being incredibly assimilative, right? Because it could, including Christianity, including the mystical essence of every religion was utterly recognized beyond the ideology of the religion, right? And so he didn't identify as being Hindu, even though he would do teachings on the Mahabharata I mentioned that last time, to the local neighborhood, right? Early mornings, and he would just do all that and bang cymbals and everything. But he was like, I do that because that's what they understand. That's how they understand this. And he actually told me that. So he wasn't, I don't want to say he wasn't diminishing it, he was respecting them, because he saw that as a valid vehicle for expression of something, but he himself. So you're right. It sounds incredibly, it can almost sound scary, like a cult leader is asking you to believe in something. I think a lot of our postmodern minds go there.
Yes.
That was not this. It is something he was saying or remarking, that I was not trusting the depth of my own experience. And he thought it must be, he couldn't understand that. So he was attributing it more, I think, to, like you said, to his idea of what a Christian framework might be, which is one where, there's lots of different forms of Christianity, of course, but a lot of it is about you. There's an inherent separation between you and the Father, or you and the Son, and the endless thing of guilt and da da da. It's not necessarily seen as a non-dual, even though I know the heart of some of Jesus's teachings were that my Father and my one are one, but you're not seen as one. It's you have to do a lot. So I think that's what he was pointing to. And I think for me, it was, it probably was, Jeff, as you said, it wasn't that I was necessarily identified as being Christian, but I think that my Western identity with a worldview where you're brought up as inherently separate from life, from life and the world, and from self, and even from God. That's why he said Christianity, because God is normally up there, and that's probably how he saw it.
Right.
And so you're right. And he wasn't asking me to switch ideologies. He was just saying he thought that was in the way of me recognizing the depth, excuse me, of my own realization.
So would you say, it's okay, go ahead. Okay.
Sorry about that. Yeah,
that's okay.
Coughing. Yeah.
It happens. So that was your first meeting with Nisargadatta, and we're not going to go through the whole time you were with him, of course, in this podcast.
Yeah.
But you then were with him for the summer, essentially every day. And it was just the two of you. I mean, sometimes it would be with, as you said, the local people would come, but it sounded like most days you and he went for walks or spent time together. There was a lot of you and him time during that summer.
Definitely. Yes.
And
yeah.
Would you say that looking back at it now, not from the eyes that you had at the time, but looking back at it now, I mean, most people like me, I would assume that must have been incredibly spiritually formative to have that much one-on-one time with a teacher who's so recognized to be such a powerful transmitter of that non-dual view. I can't imagine it wasn't, even if you weren't aware of it, at unconscious levels, deeply formative. And I'm wondering now, as you look back at that time that you spent with him, how you see it in terms of what it gave you and how it shaped the rest of your life.
Yes. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I have reflected on that. I would say that period I had, those extended years of India, doing a lot of sadhana, and I spent time with Krishnamurti, a few people, not lots, but really I spent time with Ramana Maharshi's, teachings. But then with having that time with Nisargadatta, who was alive, who I engaged with, who I was with, and also, Jeff, it was in a very non-self-conscious way. You know what I mean? I utterly, obviously respected and loved him, actually, but he was a bit like Krishnamurti. He didn't like a lot of, fussing around and touching his feet or anything like that. He just wasn't like that. He's a very authentic human being in his own humanity as well. And, but you're right. I feel it was and has been and still is profoundly formative. And I think it's the way I see that is, obviously I've lived a whole life since then, but with a lot of ups and downs. But I have, I think some people consider I have or some people call it idealistic, some people call it optimistic, whatever. And, sometimes that's said in a positive way and sometimes in a not very positive way or more naive way or whatever interpretation. But I think that it actually has given me, it gave me a deep, deep, deep pre-thought, pre-mind trust in life and in the essential wholeness and actually goodness of life. I really feel that, not as an idea, but as an experience. It's literally my experience. And even though I have gone and do go through, and now I feel, what our planet is going through are not always good. They can be terrible, and they are. And I have been through many periods of my life where I've had to have real learning experiences from mistakes I've made or things I've been involved with, et cetera, et cetera. But throughout that, there has been this anchor of, and again, some people have sort of thought, well, you're a very resilient person. But I think what's the core of that? It's this. I think it comes back to this, Jeff, because I feel like that period, it was deeper than a one-off experience. It was a period long enough for something to take root, even though I wasn't like Nisargadatta. I have not been, in terms of that being an ongoing expression of who I am at all times or places, definitely not. But it's there as an anchor of my being in a certain way. I don't know how else to put it. And not just that, it's not somewhere that's an anchor I go back to. I feel it informs my relationship to life and my view of life, actually. It does, in ways that are kind of,
So today, as you live your life, and we'll do another podcast where we talk about kind of what you're doing now and what this has all led to. But as you live your life, do you find yourself contemplating that time with Nisargadatta? Does it arise at times? Do insights you had then arise at all? Has it in any sense become a conscious reference point, or is it more conscious influence on you?
I would say both. It's not something that I'll say I think about, every week or whatever, but it is imprinted in my being, right? And it's funny because Mary Acton Adams, who we both know, she also went and spent time with Nisargadatta, and she was over here the other night, and it came up actually, and she also said it's imprinted there vividly, right? It's vivid. And so I think, and it is something that I think about. I think that the insights, and also it took me quite a lot of years to understand some of even the thing I told you about trust. At first I thought, as I think as a Westerner, you think, oh, just being told to trust something and trust it, that's it, is far more profound than that. And, we're talking about something that for a Westerner is incredibly hard to do, not to trust somebody, but to let go to that, I don't know, I can't think of the word to put, but to the depth of who we really are, of our own, of consciousness, to let that be the guide and who we are, and to embody that so greatly that doesn't matter, and doesn't mean that things don't rise to trouble you or that all kind of things, but you are anchored somewhere else. There's something that gives you the capacity to know even that is what it is. It's an arising. In India, obviously, they call them samskaras. We call them tendencies. They could be cultural, personal, whatever. Structures is another word. So when you're so deeply grounded in that or connected to the truth of that, then those things don't trouble you as much or trip you up as much, put it that way. So it took me a long time to, and I think I still at times, contemplate those truths. And I've understood a lot more of that time with him than I did at the time. And I had the experience of it, and it impacted and imprinted, but my understanding, and I think I might be wrong, but benefiting from those.
I mean, I really think you are, for whatever that's worth. But I think it's an interesting point you're bringing up, which is you were there at I don't know how old you were, 21, 22. with this, retired enlightened sage who the world hadn't discovered yet, who, by all accounts, not just yours, but any account I've ever read, was just a powerhouse of kind of spiritual realization. And on the one hand, you did have this incredible openness. Obviously, you had left Australia to go to India in pursuit of something. You read this book and left the week later to cross India. So there was a tremendous receptivity and openness that you were encountering him with. And at the same time, you had a 21-year-old brain trying to figure it out, which is interesting that there's those two levels of experience. There's the kind of experiential level of just being open and being in his presence and being pulled in to something. And then there's whatever your 21-year-old mind could figure out at the time, which then years go by and your mind expands, grows, and you learn. And so your mind's understanding of what happened changes over time.
Yes.
What happened was happening at the time, regardless of whether you understood it or not.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. I think I was probably 22. And then I think I told you I went back again when I was 23 or 24. And I was 23. Anyway, I was immature, obviously, from that level.
Right. You were that age.
Yeah. The capacity to, and also the cultural distance. I was a young, deeply conditioned, you could say, just naturally Westerner. I was a young Westerner who was the young woman of my time. So I was, like you said, on two levels, receiving that teaching from a level that had nothing to do with my culture, but how I interpreted it or responded to it was culture, from that.
Absolutely. So I find this interesting because we lived together for 20 years in a spiritual community, which was long after that, your time with Nisargadatta. And our experience coming into that was completely different because, I was much newer to the path when I encountered that community. I had never met, I had seen Ram Dass speak, I had seen Thich Nhat Hanh speak, I had seen them, but at that point they were speakers, they were going somewhere. You were in an auditorium with 500 people. And, I wasn't sitting there. I wasn't going on walks every day for 3 months. And so when I met the teacher that we eventually followed, that was my first deep encounter with someone who had, some degree of that presence. So I think it's fascinating because by the time you made that encounter with the community that we were involved in, this had happened years ago. And before this, you'd already been in India doing deep retreats for years. And after that time with Nisargadatta, you had done all, so it's just interesting to me, the richness of your spiritual life over the decades of time that you devoted to seeking, I think is it's like a remark, to me, it's a remarkable phenomenon, the amount of dedication that your life exemplifies, which is very powerful. It's powerful. It's a powerful inspiration. It's a powerful, in a way, it is your expression of your own attainment, right? That there isn't anything else for you,
right,
in life, So, and that's you have stabilized. You've lived a life that has been 100% dedicated to this, and that's kind of as stable as it gets. There's nothing else really. I just think it's beautiful.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I just to respond to that, just very briefly, you're right. There's been nothing else. That's very, very interesting. It's always been, and like I told you, we're not going to go into it now, but some of the things I'm involved in now, some people could think, whoa, very different. But to me, it's like I said, there's a through line through the whole thing. And I've never been tempted. I've done all kind of things, but this has always informed that. Or yeah, exactly.
Yes, I just wanted to make mention that what you're involved in now is some very important and significant and serious political activism, which could seem very different, but at the same time, I think it's not too far reach to see how it's the same. How it's a continuation, and we will talk about that. But yes, I just, you are an inspiration to me. You have been for a long time, and you continue to be, because of the one pointed focus of your life on spirit, which is a big part of why I want to talk with you. And I feel like it's a message. It's, just in the same way that you were encountering something with Nisargadatta that may have been beyond what you could understand, and maybe beyond understanding, period, anyway, I don't know. But in the same way, I think your life story, as people hear more about how you've dedicated yourself for so long, it's an encounter with a possibility. And this was the big possibility that I got when I met Andrew Cohen, our previous teacher. And I remember it distinctly. The first time I heard him speak, I realized that what he was fundamentally telling me was I could devote my entire life to spiritual pursuit. And no one had ever told me that before.
Right.
Like, before him, I had just assumed it had to be something more like a hobby.
Right.
That you did on the side, but that it could never be the most important thing. And he was saying, it only really works if it's the most important thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's, your life demonstrates the possibility of a life in which the pursuit of the ultimate spiritual realization is the most important thing.
I think that's why we connect, Jeff.
I think that is,
like spirit somehow. And just to say that, I feel, dedicated is an interesting, I think that's dedicated, but I just feel incredibly, fortunate, in the deepest way, because I feel I was, I think there's a kind of calling. I don't mean that in a lofty way, but just, it was almost like I had no choice, and I did, obviously I've gone with this, but I still feel that. And even this latest work I'm doing, I often thought there was a book about fundamentalism called The Reluctant Fundamentalist. And I often think I'm the reluctant activist.
Right.
There's a certain level of me that can't believe I'm doing what I'm doing. And yet there's this calling that's the same one, that's driven by the same optimism, actually.
Right. Now, and I think this is a really good point, because I don't see you as someone who is dedicated in the way that, like, I might be dedicated to working out every day, right? Which is basically I have to force myself to do it.
Right. Yes.
It's a kind of, it has more to do with the kind of trust that you were describing, Nisargadatta talked to you about, which is you just trust that this is the most important thing. You're not weighing 6 different things and deciding to keep choosing this one. It's just the only one that really matters to you.
Yes. Yeah. The only one that seems ultimately, I don't mean real, like the other things aren't real, but ultimately real. Ultimately, it's that level.
And I can relate to that. It's just, it is the most important thing. It's not that other things aren't important, but this one's at least a little more important than everything else.
And it's connected to everything else. That's the other
Absolutely.
thing. Do you know what I mean? It's connected. It's the, without that, everything else becomes a little bit, how can you say, skewed.
Yes.
And the connectedness between that which is significant can get obscured and even can be obscure, can be, how can I say, anyway, it's a whole nother conversation, but I think a lot of the mess that happens is because we're disconnected from that. That's why,
I think that's true. So we'll end this because we have so much more to talk about. So I think the next time we talk, we should talk about your current work and we'll relate it back to all this.
Yeah.
And I think I need to hear more about some of your time with, I can't remember his name, the beggar.
Oh yeah, Ramsurat Kumar.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
Yuji
yeah.
Krishnamurti and the other
different
half
people.
dozen or so teachers that you
Yeah.
had the privilege of spending some time with, and we'll slowly unravel this story. But I really want to thank you so much for talking with me today.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. It's really, it's just a privilege to talk about this, and in a certain way, it's like honoring Sri Nisargadatta, who he is and what he is now still, so thank you. And I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So
we'll talk again.
We definitely will.